She ran billion-dollar boardrooms without flinching, but one quiet man with grease-stained hands and a daughter who drew pictures of sunflowers saw straight through the armor she spent a decade building. What happened between them in the 6 days before the gala wasn't supposed to happen at all. And when her perfect world cracked open in front of every person who mattered, only he was standing close enough to hold the pieces. If this story already has you curious, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let's begin. The morning the Sterling name came back to Alderview Resort, the maintenance crew felt it before they saw it. There was a quality to the air that shifted, something between electricity and dread. The way a sky changes color 30 minutes before a storm rolls in off the coast. By 7:15, 3 black SUVs were idling in the circular drive, and by 7:30, the resort's general manager, Dale Hutchins, was speed-walking through the lobby in a sport coat he'd clearly grabbed in a hurry, one collar point folded under instead of out, his forehead already damp. Ethan Cross noticed the collar. He noticed because he was coming from the East Service corridor with the equipment manifest tucked under his arm and a travel mug of coffee going cold in his hand, and Dale nearly walked through him. "She's early," Dale said, without preamble, without apology for almost bowling Ethan over. His eyes were scanning the lobby like a man trying to account for every imperfection simultaneously. Ethan looked past him toward the main entrance. "How early?" 45 minutes. Dale pulled out his phone, already composing a message to someone. "I need your team on the Grand Terrace by 8, full sweep. She's walking the event space this morning. We were scheduled for 11. "I know when we were scheduled, Ethan." Dale looked up from his phone long enough to make eye contact, and what was in his face wasn't irritation exactly. It was closer to controlled panic wearing an irritation mask. "Can you do 8? Ethan thought about it for 2 seconds. His lead hand, Marcus, was already on property. 2 of his other crew guys were in the parking structure finishing a generator check. It was doable. Tight, but doable. "Yeah," he said. "We can do 8. Dale nodded, exhaled through his nose, and was already moving again. "Good. And Ethan," he paused without turning around, "make sure it actually looks good, not service department good. Actually good." Ethan watched him go, then took a long sip of his cooling coffee. He'd heard the name Sterling plenty of times in the 2 years he'd worked at Alderview. The resort had played host to the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala for 6 consecutive years, and every year it was the same cycle of institutional anticipation, upper management getting twitchy weeks in advance, the housekeeping department retraining staff on protocol, the F&B team sourcing ingredients from vendors they didn't normally work with. It was the kind of event that made a property's whole annual reputation, and the Sterling name was the gravitational center of all of it. What Ethan knew about Victoria Sterling was what most people knew. 30 years old, inherited the Sterling Group empire from her father 18 months ago, under circumstances that had fed the gossip columns for the better part of a year, sat on the boards of 4 nonprofits, had been photographed at charity functions on 3 different continents in the last 12 months, and ran her late father's company with a precision that had, by most accounts, silenced the skeptics who'd said she was too young and too green to hold it together. He'd never met her, had no particular opinion of her. He went to find Marcus. Opet. By 7:58, Ethan's crew had opened the Grand Terrace, a sweeping event space that wrapped around the resort's north-facing cliffside, with views of the bay that looked almost too composed to be real, and begun their systematic walkthrough of the rigging points, the electrical load pathways, and the temporary staging infrastructure that had been partially installed the previous week. The gala was 6 days out. Ethan's role at Alderview was technical crew supervisor, which meant he sat somewhere between the contractors who came in for specific jobs and the permanent resort staff, overseeing the physical infrastructure of large-scale events, lighting rigs, AV frameworks, structural installations, power management. He'd fallen into event technical work the way a lot of people fall into things, sideways, out of necessity, after the industry he'd originally trained for stopped being available to him in the way he needed. He'd been a licensed electrician before Lily was born. Had his own small outfit, 2 employees, decent contracts with commercial developers in the metro area. Then his wife left when Lily was 11 months old. Not dramatically, not with screaming or broken dishes, just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I can't do this." and an absence that became permanent, and the calculus of his life changed completely. He couldn't be running jobs that kept him away from home until 8 or 9 at night with a baby who needed him. Couldn't keep bidding on projects with 4-week installation windows. He needed something with structure, with on-site hours, with the kind of predictability that let him pick up his daughter from daycare at a consistent time. A resort was, in its way, an ecosystem. The hours were long sometimes, but they were contained. The work kept him close to his electrical background without the entrepreneurial exposure that had started to feel incompatible with single parenthood. And Alderview paid well enough that he and Lily could maintain their small apartment, afford the after-school program she loved, and occasionally go out for the good tacos on a Friday night. It was a life that fit together imperfectly, but held. He was crouched by the primary rigging anchor on the terrace's east side, checking a splice in the safety cable that had concerned him on his preliminary walk the week before, when he heard the doors from the interior corridor open. He didn't look up immediately. He heard Dale's voice, that particular cadence Dale used when he was performing hospitality for someone important, smooth and slightly elevated, like a man reading from a script he'd memorized. And he heard another voice underneath it, lower than he expected, deliberate in the way it moved through sentences, not slow, but weighted. He glanced up. Victoria Sterling was not what the photographs had suggested, though Ethan couldn't have articulated exactly what the photographs had gotten wrong. She was taller than he'd expected, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a white blouse with the kind of effortless fit that meant it had been made for her specifically, dark hair pulled back, and she was holding a tablet and a leather portfolio simultaneously, already scanning the space before Dale had finished his introductory remarks about the terrace's event capacity. She looked, Ethan thought, like someone who had been awake since 4:30. Not tired exactly, just occupied. The way certain people carry a constant background load of ongoing calculation that never fully goes quiet, even when they're standing still. "The eastern staging anchor is flagged," he heard her say to Dale, without preamble, not looking at the spot she was referencing, but clearly already knowing its location. "The load-bearing assessment from your structural team shows a 700-pound variance from the installation spec. I want that resolved before Wednesday." Dale made a note. "Absolutely. I'll have our crew—" "Who's your technical supervisor on this event?" Dale gestured. Ethan, still crouched by the anchor in question, became aware that both of them were now looking at him. He stood up. "Ethan Cross," Dale said. "He's been with us 2 years. He'll be overseeing the full technical installation for the gala." Victoria Sterling walked toward him, not in the aggressive way of someone trying to establish dominance, just directly, the way people move when they're used to covering ground efficiently. She stopped at a reasonable distance, looked at him, then looked at the anchor point he'd been examining. "That the variance?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I flagged it last week. The original installation used a standard commercial rigging spec, but the lighting rig we're bringing in for Saturday runs heavier than the original plan accounted for. We need to retrofit the anchor with a supplemental bracket rated for the additional load." "When can you have it done?" "I have the parts on order. Should be here tomorrow morning. I can have the retrofit completed by end of day tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment, not sizing him up exactly, more like running a quick cross-reference between what he was saying and what she already knew about the problem. Then she nodded once, made a note on her tablet. "I'll need a written confirmation of the corrected spec when it's done," she said. "I'll have it to Dale by tomorrow evening." "Have it to me directly." She held out her tablet, showing him a contact entry. "I'm the one who needs to sign off on structural changes." Ethan looked at the contact entry, then at her. "Okay," he said, and took out his own phone to add the number. She was already turning back to Dale, moving on to the next item. "The sponsor display wall placement doesn't work where you have it marked. If you put the donor tier signage there, it blocks the sight line from the north entrance, which is where the major table assignments are clustered. Move it 12 feet toward the interior." Dale made another note. Ethan went back to his anchor. He thought about her precisely once more, before noon, and only because Marcus brought her up. "Sterling's people were in the service corridor," Marcus said, coming to find Ethan in the equipment staging area where Ethan was reviewing load calculations. Marcus was 38, built like he'd spent his 20s on a construction site because he had, and operated with the particular ease of a man who was genuinely good at his job and knew it. 3 of them, measuring things. What things? I don't know, everything. Wall clearances, cable path widths. One of them had a laser measure and was going section by section down the whole corridor. Ethan processed this. Okay. You meet her? Yeah. Marcus waited. She knew about the anchor variants, Ethan said. Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly. Before or after she walked in? Before. Marcus considered this. Dale's a wreck. Dale's always a wreck when Sterling Foundation comes through. This year feels different. Marcus leaned against the equipment case, arms crossed. You know she's been at 4 other sites this week, personally walking each vendor location? My buddy works lighting for the AV company they contracted, and he said she called their team lead at 6 in the morning last Tuesday to go over the cue sheet. Ethan looked up from the load calculations. 6 in the morning? His words. Ethan thought about that for a moment. The woman he'd met on the terrace, standing at the edge of the bay view with a tablet and a portfolio, already cataloging problems before Dale finished his sentence. Running on however many hours of sleep 6 a.m. calls aloud. What's the total donor number this year, he asked. Heard 2.3 million in targeted pledges, Marcus said, plus live auction. Could be closer to 3. That was a large number. Not an abstract large number, a real one, with weight behind it, programs that depended on it, outcomes that lived or died based on whether Saturday night went clean. He understood, in a different way than he had that morning, why she was walking every site herself. He went back to his calculations. The days before a large event had a particular texture in Ethan's experience, a slow-building compression, like a weather system organizing itself. Tuesday was logistics, Wednesday was installation, Thursday was dry run, Friday was adjustment, Saturday was execution. What he hadn't fully accounted for was how Victoria Sterling's presence would alter the texture of that compression. She was at the resort every day. Not in a disruptive way. She didn't sweep through with an entourage demanding deference, didn't treat the staff with the particular brand of careless authority that some wealthy people defaulted to, the manner that suggested the people serving you were interchangeable with the furniture. She brought 2 assistants, moved through the property with purpose, and was, by Ethan's observation, genuinely doing work rather than performing oversight. The distinction mattered. She remembered people's names. On Wednesday morning, she addressed Marcus by name without prompting. Ethan hadn't been in the room when they met. And when she caught one of the junior resort staff struggling with a heavy equipment cart on the service ramp, she stopped, asked the guy's name, asked where the cart needed to go, and held the door. Small things. But the kind of small things that either happened or didn't, and the people around you always noticed which. What Ethan also noticed, and noticed only because his job required him to be attentive to the logistics of the space, which meant paying attention to the people moving through it, was that by Wednesday afternoon she hadn't, to his knowledge, eaten anything since the breakfast meeting she'd had with the resort's catering director at 8 in the morning. He knew this because he'd been in and out of the planning suites 3 times that day for equipment checks, and each time he passed the room her team was working out of. The same half-finished fruit plate that had come up with the morning meeting was sitting on the credenza, untouched past the first few bites. This was, in the grand scheme of his professional responsibilities, none of his business. He went and finished his cable routing check. At 4:30, passing the planning suite again, he heard her on a call through the half-open door. Her voice had the same controlled quality it always did, but there was something underneath it, a strain at the edges, the particular register of someone holding a line that was getting harder to hold. I understand the committee's concern, but the venue change is not an option at this point. We are 6 days out. The infrastructure is already partially installed. A pause. Senator, with respect, if the donor placement issue is about table positioning rather than actual proximity to the speaker platform, that is something we can adjust without... Another pause. Longer. I hear you. Yes, I'll make it work. She came out of the suite 20 seconds later with her tablet under her arm and nearly walked into Ethan, who was standing in the corridor checking a cable run on his manifest. She stopped, looked at him. Sorry, she said, which surprised him, because she was the one who'd almost been walked into, not the cause of the collision. "You're fine," he said. Then, before he'd quite decided to say it, "Have you eaten today?" She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not offended, not warm. Somewhere between assessing and genuinely uncertain what to do with the question. "At breakfast," she said. "It's 4:30. I'm aware of the time. There's a deli counter on the resort's north end. They make a pretty decent turkey sandwich. Takes about 4 minutes. She held his gaze for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, maybe for her to say something clipped and move on, or to simply walk past him without responding. Instead, she said, "I have a call with the florist vendor in 15 minutes. Turkey sandwich takes 4 minutes. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The kind where the thought happens before the expression does. She looked at him for one more second, like she was deciding something. "I don't know what I'd want," she said. "Turkey's good," he said. "I'm going that way. I'll bring you one." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she said, "No mustard." "Got it." He brought her the sandwich, left it on the credenza next to the fruit plate and didn't make a production of it. When he came back through the corridor 40 minutes later, both the fruit plate and the sandwich wrapper were gone. Thursday was when the first real problem hit. It came from the permit side, a miscommunication between the resort's operations department and the county fire marshal's office about the maximum occupancy variance the gala required for the terrace setup. The event was planned for 240 guests on a space that, under standard configuration, held 180. The variance had been applied for 6 weeks earlier, but had apparently been filed under the wrong event classification, which meant it was sitting in the wrong processing queue, which meant it hadn't been approved, which meant that as of Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, the terrace setup they'd been installing all week wasn't legal for the number of people who'd bought seats. Ethan heard about it from Dale, who came to find him in the middle of a lighting rig check, with the look of a man who had just learned his house was on fire. "Is the Victoria Sterling version of this already happening, or are you telling me first?" Ethan asked. "She has a meeting in 12 minutes. I'm telling you first because I need to know if reconfiguring the floor plan to reduce the legal occupancy is something your team can do by Saturday morning." Ethan looked at his manifest, then at the rig above them. "Depends what the reconfiguration looks like. If it's purely about table count and positioning, yeah. If the fire marshal wants actual structural changes to the flow path, I don't know yet. I'm waiting on a callback. Get me the details when you have them. I'll look at what's movable." Dale left. Ethan climbed back up the ladder to continue the rig check. He heard about the Sterling version of it 20 minutes later from one of the catering staff who'd been walking past the planning suite when the conversation happened. By the account, which was admittedly secondhand and probably embellished, it had been short and contained and had ended with Victoria saying, in a very quiet voice, that someone was going to spend the rest of Thursday on the phone with the fire marshal's office until the problem was solved, and that someone was going to be her communications director, and that if it wasn't solved by end of day, she would be in the fire marshal's office at 8 Friday morning herself. By 4 o'clock Thursday, the variance had been refiled under the correct classification and escalated through a channel that Dale's operations team probably should have used 6 weeks ago. The marshal's office, apparently persuaded by the combination of urgency and the size of the charitable mission the event served, agreed to expedite. Ethan, whose equipment check had surfaced a secondary issue with the power draw on the West Wing lighting string, spent Thursday evening recalculating his load distribution and found a solution by 9 p.m. He was in the parking structure retrieving the correct gauge extension cable when he saw her. Victoria Sterling was sitting on a low concrete barrier near the staff entrance, not using her phone, not on a call, just sitting. Her blazer was draped over the barrier next to her, and she was in her shirt sleeves, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has temporarily set down a very heavy bag and is trying to remember what their hands feel like without it. She didn't see him at first. He thought about walking past, pretending he hadn't. It would have been easy. The cable was in the opposite direction. He had a genuine reason to be moving that way. Instead, because he was apparently the kind of person who couldn't leave things alone, he said, "Long day." She looked up. Her composure reassembled itself in about half a second, which told him something about how much practice she'd had. "Long week," she said. He leaned against the concrete pillar across from her, not crowding her, just stopping. Permit thing got resolved. I know. I'm the one who resolved it. I know you are. He said it without flattery or irony, just acknowledgement. I'm saying it worked out. She looked at him. In the parking structure's flat fluorescent light, she looked less like a billboard version of herself and more like a person who had been running at capacity for longer than was sustainable. It almost didn't, she said, but it did. She didn't say anything for a moment, then, you have a daughter. He blinked. Yeah. Dale mentioned it, in passing. She said it neutrally, not as an intrusion, more like someone who had filed a piece of information and was now surfacing it. How old? 6. Lily. Who has her while you're here late? My neighbor, Mrs. Okonkwo. She's retired, has 3 grandkids of her own, and charges me $40 per evening and the occasional batch of the banana bread Lily makes with her. Something moved across Victoria's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. Banana bread is currency. It's better than I make it sound. Lily puts chocolate chips in. Does she know you're working on something like this? He thought about it. I told her there's a party at the hotel, a big one. She asked if there would be balloons. Will there? Probably. Then she has better information than most of my donors. He almost laughed at that. Not because it was the funniest thing he'd heard, but because it was unexpected. The dry realness of it, the lack of performance. You should go home and sleep, he said. I have 3 vendor calls in the morning. I know, so sleep first. He pushed off the pillar. The permit thing got resolved. The anchor retrofit is signed off. Tomorrow's going to have its own problems. They always do. But tonight's problems are done. She looked at him for a moment, and it was a different kind of looking than the assessment she'd done on the terrace Monday morning. Quieter. Like something being considered rather than evaluated. You're not what I expected, she said, from a technical crew supervisor. I get that a lot, he said, which wasn't true at all, but it made her almost smile happen again. He found his cable and headed back to the East Wing. Bans. Friday was, as predicted, its own species of problem. A catering vendor canceled a partial order due to a warehouse inventory issue, creating a protein course gap for 46 table settings that needed to be resolved in 18 hours. One of the sponsor display banners arrived with a printing error in a major donor's company name. The audio technician contracted for the live portion of the program discovered on his dry run that the terrace's natural acoustics, combined with the new speaker placement, was creating a feedback loop in the 40 to 50-foot range that would affect the first 3 donor tables. Each of these problems was solvable. None of them were simple. Ethan watched Victoria move through them. She was good, not in the way of someone performing competence for an audience, but in the actual operational way. She triaged fast, delegated cleanly, knew which problems she needed to be in the middle of and which ones she needed to hand off and trust. When the catering issue surfaced, she was on the phone with an alternate supplier within 4 minutes and had a provisional commitment within 12. When the banner error came in, she looked at it for 15 seconds, said, reprint and overnight from the vendor. They cover the cost, I'll make the call myself, and moved to the next thing. The audio problem took longer because audio problems always took longer, and this one required Ethan to work with the sound technician to redesign the speaker positioning, which meant dismantling part of the rig arrangement they'd spent Wednesday building. He did it without complaint, though it added 4 hours to his Friday. At some point in the early afternoon, a plate appeared at his equipment staging table. Turkey sandwich, no mustard. He looked around, didn't see her. He ate it. By Friday evening, they'd lost the formally professional quality of their interactions without either of them making a deliberate decision about it. It happened the way most things happen in high-pressure environments where people are working toward the same end, incrementally, through accumulated moments where there was no time for social formality, and they'd simply stopped performing it. He called her Victoria instead of Miss Sterling, not because he'd decided to, but because he'd forgotten not to, and she hadn't corrected him. She asked his opinion on things, not decoratively, actually asked, the way you ask someone whose judgment you've noticed is calibrated differently than yours. When the speaker positioning redesign produced two viable options, each with a different trade-off, she came to find him in the staging area and laid both options out and said, "Which one?" and listened to his reasoning. She chose the one he recommended. He noticed she had a habit of pressing her thumb against the side of her index finger when she was thinking something through, a small, specific gesture that she seemed unaware of. He noticed she was more decisive on operational problems than on interpersonal ones, and that the one conversation Friday that visibly unsettled her was a call with someone whose name he didn't catch, whose voice through the phone produced a tension in her jaw that none of the day's logistical crises had created. He didn't ask about that. At 9 o'clock Friday night, with the gala 22 hours away, they were both in the Grand Terrace doing a final technical walkthrough, she with her tablet and he with his manifest. And the bay outside the windows was dark, except for the running lights of a distant boat. And the space was quiet in the way that event spaces go quiet the night before. All the infrastructure in place, waiting, the potential of the room held in suspension. "It looks right," she said, standing at the center of the floor, looking out at the bay. "It does," he said, and meant it. It did look right. The rig work was clean, the staging was solid, the sightlines worked. He'd done good work this week, and so had his crew, and the evidence of it was visible in the assembled space. She turned from the window and picked up the planning sheet she'd left on the nearest table. The master document, annotated in multiple pens, the physical record of the week's problems and solutions and adjustments. She held it for a moment, then set it down. Picked up a pen. Wrote 2 words on the top corner of the sheet. "See you tomorrow," she said, and walked out. Ethan stayed a moment in the quiet room, looked at the view, looked down at the planning sheet. In her handwriting, in the top corner, she'd written, "After Saturday." He stood there for a few seconds, not sure what he was feeling exactly. Then he rolled up his manifest, tucked it under his arm, and went home to relieve Mrs. Okonkwo and check on Lily, who had, according to a text from his neighbor, fallen asleep on the couch, waiting up for him with a picture she'd drawn of balloons she wanted to see at the party. He looked at the drawing for a long time before he turned off the light. He thought about the 2 words on his drive home, "After Saturday." It could mean nothing. It could be an instruction to herself. After Saturday, do this thing, follow up on that thing. Remember to, some internal notation that happened to land on a shared document. Victoria Sterling was a woman who kept lists, who organized her world in advance, who planned beyond the horizon of the current problem. After Saturday could be purely procedural. It could also mean something else. And the fact that she'd written it in front of him and looked at him when she set the pen down and said, "See you tomorrow," with something in her voice that was careful in a particular way. He stopped himself. She was a billionaire. He was a technical crew supervisor with a 6-year-old and a neighbor who accepted banana bread as childcare currency. The week had been intense, the way intense work weeks were, the kind that created temporary intimacy between people who were otherwise strangers. He'd brought her a sandwich. She'd brought him one. That wasn't a story. That was just 2 tired people being decent to each other under pressure. He pulled into his parking spot, sat in the car for a minute, and looked at the light in his apartment window where Mrs. Okonkwo had left the lamp on. After Saturday. He thought about his daughter's drawing of balloons. He thought about the way Victoria's composure had gone quiet in the parking structure, just for those few minutes, like a frequency dropping below the range where it had to perform anything. He thought about what it meant to carry something alone for long enough that you forgot what it felt like not to. He went upstairs. Oh. Saturday started the way it was always going to start, with something going wrong. Ethan arrived at the resort at 6:15 to find one of his crew's power distribution panels had tripped overnight, cutting feed to a section of the terrace lighting that had been perfectly functional at last check. It took him 45 minutes to trace the fault, reset the breaker, and verify that the rest of the panel was clean before he could begin the morning's activation sequence. By 7:30, the first vendors were arriving for setup. By 9, the space was alive with the controlled chaos of final event preparation. Caterers rolling linen-covered carts, the floristry team unloading arrangements that filled the air with a specific clean green smell, the audio tech running his final calibration sequence on the speaker system. Ethan was running his own sequence, a methodical, systematic activation and check of every element his team had installed. He moved through the space with his tablet and his earpiece, talking to Marcus and the rest of his crew, monitoring each system as it came online. He saw Victoria Sterling arrive at 9:45. She was in a different register than the week, same quality of attention, same deliberate movement through the space, but dressed now for the evening ahead rather than the working week. A deep blue that managed to look serious and formal simultaneously, her hair differently arranged. She had her two assistants with her and a phone to her ear, and she was moving through the vendor stations, conducting final checks with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. She passed close enough to Ethan at one point that he could have said something. She caught his eye over the head of the florist she was conferring with. She gave him a single nod. Quick, specific. A professional acknowledgement. The language of, your side good, my side good. Okay, he nodded back. He went to check the West Wing power routing. The gala guests began arriving at 7. Ethan wasn't a guest. He was in his earpiece, moving through the service routes that ran alongside the event space, available if anything needed his hands. This was the phase of the event he understood least emotionally, the part where the infrastructure he'd spent the week building disappeared into the background of the actual occasion, became invisible, which was the only way to know it had been done right. From the service corridor, through the glass panels, he caught glimpses. The terrace glittering with the full lighting design operational, the tables set with the floristry that he'd watched arrive that morning in bundles and bins, the guests in their formal clothes moving through a space that felt, from the outside, effortless. He'd built that effortlessness. His crew had. Every problem they'd solved, every late adjustment they'd made, every hour they'd spent in the space was invisible now, which meant it was working. He had a moment, standing in the service corridor with the event visible through glass, of something that he didn't have an exact name for. Satisfaction was close. Pride was close. There was also something lonelier in it than either of those words captured, the particular ache of making something good and watching it happen without you. He thought about Lily's balloon drawing, thought about after Saturday. He put his hand on the earpiece and checked in with Marcus on the West Wing. The earpiece crackled. Marcus's voice was steady. All green on the west. How's the center? Good, Ethan said. Everything's holding. He watched the terrace through the glass. Everything was holding. The gala had been running for 2 hours when the first real fracture appeared. Ethan was in the service corridor checking a minor fluctuation on the lighting board. A single channel in the center cluster had been pulling slightly low, not enough for guests to notice, but enough to bother him. When his earpiece crackled and Marcus said, Hey, you might want to come out front. What's happening? Vendor situation. Catering. One of the senior donor tables got the wrong course sequence. Ethan closed the lighting panel. How bad? Table 4. Hargrove Party. He knew the name. Everybody working this event knew the name. The Hargrove Foundation was the Sterling Gala's second largest pledging donor. And Gerald Hargrove was, by multiple accounts, the kind of man who measured respect through the quality of his inconveniences. Getting his table's course sequence wrong was not a small error. It was exactly the kind of thing that traveled, the kind of story that gets told at the next event and the one after that. Ethan came out through the side panel and into the main event space. The terrace was beautiful in the way that well-executed event spaces become beautiful when they're fully alive. The lighting design working at its intended depth, the floristry arrangements catching the warm overhead wash, the bay visible through the open panels as a dark expanse with the city's edge glittering in the distance. 238 guests in formal wear moving through it, the low-layered sound of a room full of people engaged with each other, a string quartet in the northeast corner working through something understated. He spotted the situation before he spotted Victoria. Table 4 was in the center north section, and it was visibly tense. 3 guests with expressions that said they were being gracious through effort, a catering staff member who looked like he was trying to disappear, and Gerald Hargrove himself, a man in his late 60s with white hair and the particular stillness of someone who has decided to be disappointed and is waiting for someone sufficiently senior to deliver that disappointment to. Victoria was already there. She'd come from across the room and she was standing at the table now, speaking to Hargrove directly, her posture impeccable, her tone measured. Ethan moved closer without entering the immediate radius, close enough to hear, far enough to stay invisible. Understand completely, and I want you to know this is being corrected right now, Victoria was saying. The course will be reset from the correct point in the sequence. You won't miss anything. Hargrove looked at her with the expression of a man who has made his living reading people and has reached a conclusion. Victoria, he said, and the way he said her first name had a specific texture, the kind of familiarity that condescends rather than warms. I've been coming to this event for 5 years, 3 under your father. This is the second issue my table has experienced tonight. I'm aware, she said, and I take responsibility for both. What was the first? Ethan said. Both of them looked at him. Victoria's expression was unreadable. Hargrove's was the expression of a man surprised that an unfamiliar voice had entered his conversation. The table placement, Hargrove said. We were moved 12 feet from our original reservation. The placement was changed for sightline optimization, Ethan said, keeping his voice neutral. The speaker platform was repositioned based on acoustic requirements. Every table in the north cluster was adjusted proportionally. Your table is actually closer to the speaker position than it was in the original layout, not farther. Hargrove looked at him for a moment. And you are? Ethan Cross, technical crew supervisor. He didn't offer a handshake, and it wasn't that kind of moment. The course sequencing issue is ours to fix, and it's getting fixed right now. But the table position was intentional, and it was done in the interest of the evening you're about to experience. It was a small thing. Probably not the thing that resolved Gerald Hargrove's disposition, which was likely to remain in the register of gracious disappointment regardless. But it shifted the frame of the conversation, moved it from apology into explanation, which was different, which had different weight. Victoria looked at Ethan for half a second, then back to Hargrove. Your courses will be corrected and properly timed from this point. If there's anything else your table needs tonight, please find me directly. She held his gaze. Thank you for being here, Gerald. This event exists because of donors like your family. Hargrove nodded. Not warmly, but acceptingly. Victoria turned and walked. Ethan fell into step beside her without planning to, because they were moving in the same direction, and it would have been strange not to. You didn't need to do that, she said quietly. He was going to blame the placement on incompetence. It wasn't incompetent. I know it wasn't. She glanced at him sideways. I meant you didn't need to step in. I had it. I know you did. They were near the service entrance now, moving out of the immediate flow of guests. She stopped, turned to face him partially, the noise of the room behind them. Is the lighting fluctuation on Channel 9 resolved? She asked. He blinked. How do you know about Channel 9? I know about most things that happen in this building. She said it without superiority, just flatly, as fact. Is it resolved? I was working on it when Marcus called me out. Go finish it. She paused. And Ethan, thank you. For the table. He went back to the lighting panel. He stood in the service corridor for a moment before reopening it, not sure what had just happened exactly, only that something had, and that it had the quality of something that couldn't be taken back. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. He opened the panel and got back to work. What? The next hour was clean. Events had rhythms, and this one had found its stride. The kind of operational smoothness that only happened when enough problems had been solved in advance, when the infrastructure was holding, when the people running the room had done the work. Ethan moved through his checklist. The audio technician gave him a thumbs up on the speaker calibration. The West Wing lighting came fully online. Channel 9 stopped its fluctuation. At 9:15, the program portion began. Ethan watched it from the side panel where the service corridor met the event space in a glass section that let him see without being part of. The MC, a local anchor from the regional news affiliate who had clearly done this kind of event before, moved through the opening remarks with professional warmth. The first speaker was a program director from one of the Sterling Foundation's funded medical research initiatives, a woman in her 50s who talked about the work with the specific directness of someone who understood that the people in this room needed to feel the consequence of their donations rather than just hear numbers. Then Victoria walked to the platform. He'd seen her in a lot of modes this week. He hadn't seen this one. She stood at the microphone with a stillness that was different from her operational stillness, less about efficiency, more about intention. When she spoke, the room found a different quality of quiet, the particular quiet that falls when people are genuinely listening rather than performing the appearance of listening. "This event is not about the sterling name," she said. "I want to be clear about that. It never was, even when my father stood at this microphone. It's about what happens when resources meet need in a way that's structured and sustained and real." She paused. 3 years ago, the foundation funded a clinical trial for a childhood neurological condition that affects an estimated 46,000 children in this country. 14 months ago, that trial produced results that are now informing a treatment protocol being adopted by 8 pediatric hospitals. Tonight, there are children who will have different lives than they would have had. That is the sentence I need you to hold on to through the rest of this evening. Ethan stood in the service corridor with his tablet at his side and watched. She was not performing the speech. She was saying it. The distinction was visible in the way it was visible when anything was genuine versus rehearsed. Something in the quality of attention required, the absence of the slight excess energy that performance always left at the edges. He thought about what Marcus had said earlier in the week. She's been at 4 other sites personally. He thought about the 6 a.m. calls, about the half-finished fruit plate on Wednesday, about the way she'd sat on the concrete barrier in the parking structure with her blazer off, and the controlled distance briefly missing from her face. She was carrying all of this, the donors, the program outcomes, the institutional weight of the sterling name, the pressure of being 30 years old and being responsible for something that people doubted she could sustain. She was carrying it in a particular way that high-functioning people carried overwhelming things, by never quite setting it down, by keeping it in motion, because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. He'd done something similar after Lily's mother left, not with money or institutions, with the smaller economy of a single parent's life, the constant forward motion that kept the shape of things from collapsing. He recognized it. That was all. He looked away from the glass panel and checked his rigging sensors. It was 10 minutes after the speech, during the transition into the live auction segment, when he found her in the kitchen corridor. Not the main kitchen, the back service preparation area that ran between the main kitchen and the terrace's service entrance, a long narrow space that smelled of hot trays and industrial cleaning solution, fluorescent lit, functional. He was coming through it to relay a message to the catering team about the Hargrove table's dessert timing, and she was standing near the far end with her back to him, one hand braced against the wall, her phone face down at her side. He slowed. She heard him anyway. Turned, and once again the composure reassembled. Half a second practiced. But there was something in her eyes that she didn't manage to reorganize in time. Something that was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep deprivation. "Wrong corridor," she said. "Catering message," he said, holding up the tablet. "You okay?" "Fine." "That wasn't a real question," he said. "I mean, it was a real question. I'm asking." She looked at him for a moment. In the flat light of the service corridor, without the event space warmth, she looked her age more precisely. 30 years old, which was not old, which was in fact quite young to be standing in the middle of all of this. "Someone said something," she said, and stopped. He waited. "There's a man at table 7. Oliver Reese." The name came out with a specific quality, careful and neutral in the way people are careful and neutral about things they have actual feeling about. It was 2 years ago. He was the kind of person who makes you feel, when things are good, like you've finally found level ground. And when things stop being good, you understand that the level ground was something he constructed specifically to make you dependent on it. Ethan didn't say anything. He leaned against the wall across from her and let her keep going if she wanted. He came through the line tonight and said, she paused, pressed her thumb against the side of her index finger. He said, "Your father would have handled the Hargrove situation differently." That was it, just that, and he moved on. She looked at the middle distance. He knows exactly how to find the weight-bearing wall. "Is he wrong?" Ethan asked. She looked at him sharply. "I'm asking," he said, "because you handled the Hargrove situation. You were already handling it before I said anything. What would your father have done differently?" She was quiet for a moment. "He would have been smoother about it." "Smooth isn't the same as right." "I know that." Then what he said doesn't have information in it, Ethan said. It's just noise from someone who knows which button to press. She looked at him with an expression he didn't know how to categorize. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like someone encountering a thing they'd stopped expecting to encounter. Plainness, maybe. Directness, without angle. "You're strange," she said, and it didn't sound like an insult. "So I've been told." "Who tells you that?" "Mostly Lily. She means it affectionately." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Close. "What does she think you do all day?" "She thinks I make buildings light up." He paused. "Which is roughly accurate." "It is accurate." She straightened slightly, rolled her shoulders once, the gesture of someone picking their bag back up. "I should get back." "You should," he pushed off the wall. "And eat something. There's a cheese station at the reception table that nobody's touched." "How do you know nobody's touched it?" "Because I've been watching the room all night and the cheese station is in a low-traffic corner." She looked at him. "You watch rooms for a living?" "Basically." "That explains some things about you," she said, and walked back toward the terrace. He delivered the catering message and returned to his circuit. For the next 90 minutes, the gala ran the way it was supposed to run. The live auction moved through 11 lots and produced a final combined figure that the MC announced to genuine applause, the kind that had heat in it, that meant the number was real and people felt the scale of it. The dinner service recovered from the Hargrove setback and ran clean through the remaining courses. The string quartet shifted into a livelier register for the post-dinner hour, and the dance floor at the terrace's south end slowly filled with the specific combination of alcohol and goodwill that formal events always cultivated in their second halves. Ethan did 3 more full equipment checks. He checked in with Marcus, who reported all systems nominal. He talked the audio tech through a minor feedback sensitivity adjustment on the primary speaker feed. He stood for 11 minutes in the northwest corner of the terrace proper, having confirmed with Dale that his equipment checks were complete, and watched the room simply be what it had become, this space he'd spent a week building toward. He didn't see Victoria for most of that stretch, which meant she was working the room, doing the circuit of donor engagement that was as much a part of an event like this as the speeches or the auction. He caught glimpses. At the Hargrove table, where she stayed for nearly 15 minutes, and where Gerald Hargrove's body language had shifted from managed disappointment to something more open. Near the auction display, talking with a cluster of guests who leaned toward her the way people lean toward someone they were genuinely interested in rather than performing interest for. Across the room in the far corner, briefly, with a man Ethan didn't immediately place, dark-suited, mid-40s, standing in a way that was slightly separate from the room's current, like he hadn't fully arrived in it. Table 7, Ethan thought. Oliver Reese. He looked for a moment longer than he needed to. He couldn't hear what they were saying. The room's ambient noise and the distance made it impossible. What he could see was the quality of their posture. Reese with his weight slightly forward, the stance of a man trying to reclaim proximity. Victoria with her weight balanced, her chin level, holding her own space. The conversation was brief. She said something, he nodded, and she turned and moved away without the quality of someone who had been shaken. Ethan looked away. He thought about what she'd said in the service corridor. He knows exactly how to find the weight-bearing wall. Thought about the way she'd described it, level ground, constructed specifically to make you dependent on it. He knew something about that kind of architecture, not from Oliver Reese specifically, from his ex-wife, from the way certain people built intimacy through your vulnerabilities rather than alongside them, so that when they left, the structure of your confidence had their handprints all over it. His had taken 2 years and a 6-year-old who needed him to be capable of trust to rebuild properly. He watched Victoria move back into the center of the room, re-engaging with a cluster of guests near the donor wall with the ease of someone who had never stepped out. She was good at reassembly, maybe too good at it, in the way that skill and habit sometimes calcified into an inability to stay disassembled long enough to actually rest. He went back to checking his equipment. The evening wound toward its end at 11:15. The last guests were in the slow movement phase, lingering conversations, a few couples still on the dance floor, the particular reluctance of a successful evening to release itself. Ethan's crew was already beginning the quiet preliminary stages of breakdown, coiling cable runs in the service areas, checking the exterior rigging for the post-event disassembly schedule, cataloging the equipment inventory for transport. He was at the primary power distribution panel, his final check of the night, making sure everything could be brought down clean, when he heard his name. Victoria was behind him. She'd shed the evening slightly around the edges, one strand of hair loose from where it had been pinned, a faint quality of exhaustion finally surfacing in her bearing now that the room had thinned enough to allow it. She was holding a glass of water rather than wine, which he noted without comment. "Events wrapping," she said. "I know. We're starting the soft breakdown. The numbers came in." She said it without preface. "Auction plus pledges. It's the highest total we've had in 6 years." He looked at her. "That's good." "It's very good." She said it simply, without the performance of triumph, just the fact of it sitting there between them. "It means there are specific programs this funds, a pediatric equipment grant, a research fellowship we've been trying to sustain for 2 years, a community health initiative in 3 counties that's been operating on provisional funding." He nodded. He was thinking about the program director's speech, the children who would have different lives. "You built the room that made it possible," she said. "You and your crew." "You built the event," he said. "We built the room." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that a meaningful distinction to you?" "Yeah," he said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. The room behind her was down to 30 guests, maybe fewer, the string quartet packing up. The lighting was still at its warm operational level. He'd bring it down in stages as the room cleared, and it caught the planes of her face in the way that honest light did, not flattering exactly, just real. "After Saturday," she said. He went still. "I wrote it because I didn't have a better way to say what I was thinking," she said. "I didn't plan to say it at all. And then I was standing in that room with the bay behind me, and I wrote it because it was the truest thing I could put on paper without making it into something that had to be addressed tonight." "What does it mean?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "It means I'd like to know who you are when neither of us is working." The room was quieter now. Someone in the far corner laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that happened at the end of good evenings. Ethan looked at her and thought about the service corridor and the parking structure, and a sandwich with no mustard and 2 words in the corner of a planning sheet. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She walked back toward the remaining guests, and he watched her go. And then he turned back to his power panel and began the careful, methodical work of bringing the night down. The Sunday after the gala, Ethan slept until 8:15. This was, by the standards of his life, an extraordinary event. Lily was at his sister's for the weekend. One of 3 times a year, his sister Carla took her for 2 nights to give Ethan what Carla called human being hours, which was her way of saying she'd noticed that single parenthood had a way of slowly sanding down the parts of a person that weren't directly useful. He'd driven home from the resort at 12:40 Saturday night, eaten leftover rice standing at the kitchen counter, and fallen asleep with his phone still in his hand and the lamp on. He lay in bed on Sunday morning looking at the ceiling and thought about what Victoria had said. "I'd like to know who you are when neither of us is working." It was not a love confession. He understood that. It was something more provisional, an opening rather than an arrival, the kind of thing that required the other person to decide what to do with it. He'd said okay, and she'd walked away, and then he'd spent 2 hours bringing the room down and driven home, and eaten rice and fallen asleep, and now it was Sunday, and he didn't have her number. He had the number she'd given him Monday for the structural sign-off. He'd texted her the corrected spec confirmation Tuesday night, and she'd replied with a single, "Thank you," versus professional, contained. The initials like a small wall that said, "This channel is for business." He stared at the ceiling. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who drew sunflowers and balloons and called Mrs. Okonkwo my Nkowo, and was learning to read chapter books and was, by any reasonable measure, the most important fact of his life. He had a job he was good at. He had Marcus, who was his closest friend in the way that work friends became actual friends when you'd spent enough late nights solving the same problems. He had Carla, who called every Sunday and asked pointed questions about whether he was eating vegetables. He was not, in any objective accounting, missing things. He texted Victoria at 9 o'clock, not the VS number, the event contact she'd given him on Monday. He wrote, "The event was a success. For what it's worth, you ran it well. Ethan." He put his phone down and made coffee. She replied 11 minutes later, "I know, I'm told the cheese station went untouched. Apparently the placement was suboptimal." He read it twice, then he typed, "If you want better cheese placement advice, you'll need to consult someone who watches rooms professionally." Her reply took 4 minutes. "Are you available Thursday evening?" Not a question. Or rather, a question formatted as a statement, which he was beginning to understand was how she communicated things she was slightly uncertain about. The ones where she couldn't fully control the outcome, she removed the question mark, made it declarative, as if certainty of form could substitute for certainty of answer. He typed, "Yes." She sent an address. He told Marcus on Monday. Not because he needed to, but because Marcus was going to figure it out anyway. He had the particular attentiveness of someone who'd spent years working alongside people in high-stress situations and had learned to read the room in a way that extended to the people in it. They were doing the post-event equipment breakdown at the resort, hauling cases back to the storage facility, running the decommission checklist. Marcus was loading the lighting cable reels into the transport van when Ethan, without particular preamble, said, "I'm having dinner with Victoria Sterling Thursday." Marcus set the cable reel down, looked at Ethan. "Like a work dinner." "Like a dinner." Marcus looked at him for another moment. "Huh. That's all you've got?" "I'm processing." Marcus picked up the cable reel again. "She asked you or you asked her?" "She asked." "Huh." Marcus loaded the reel, picked up another one. "You know what you're getting into, right?" "I know what Thursday is," Ethan said. "I don't know what it becomes after that. That's usually the problem." Marcus didn't say it like a warning, just an observation, the kind that acknowledged the reality of things without trying to solve for it. "She seems real for what she is." "Yeah," Ethan said. "She does." They finished loading the van. What? Thursday was the kind of early April evening that couldn't decide if it was still winter, a cold edge in the air that pushed against the longer light, the two seasons negotiating. Ethan had changed 3 times, which he recognized as ridiculous and was unable to stop doing. He settled on dark jeans and a gray button-down and told himself that the point of the evening was specifically to not be performing anything, which meant dressing like himself, which he was fairly confident he was doing. The address was a restaurant in the Alderview Harbor District that he'd passed 100 times and never gone into. The kind of place with a handwritten menu on a chalkboard and a wine list that didn't have prices on it in a way that suggested the prices were the point. He was not, generally speaking, a handwritten chalkboard menu person. He suspected Victoria Sterling went to places like this the way she went everywhere, because she'd done the research and reached a conclusion. She was already there when he arrived, which he should have anticipated and somehow hadn't. She was at a corner table with a glass of water and a menu, and she was wearing something dark and simple, and she had the particular quality she'd had in the parking structure and in the service corridor, the quality of having temporarily set the bag down. "You're on time," she said. "I was raised by a woman who considered 5 minutes early to be 5 minutes late," he said, sitting. "Is that your mother?" "Was. She passed 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it the way people said it when they actually were, simply, without the social elaboration that usually meant the condolence was mostly for the person giving it. "She would have had opinions about this restaurant," he said. "Good or bad. She would have wanted to know why the menu doesn't have prices." Victoria looked at him. "The prices are available if you ask." "I know, she would have said that was worse." He picked up the menu. She was a practical woman. "Mine isn't," Victoria said, and then paused, and he could see her recalibrating. Not pulling back exactly, more like acknowledging that she'd opened a door and deciding to leave it open. "My mother lives in Monaco. She's been there since my parents divorced, which was 15 years ago. We speak on her birthday and occasionally when she's read something about me in the press." "She reads about you in the press?" "It's apparently how she keeps current." She said it dry, flat, the kind of delivery that had learned to live alongside something painful without being undone by it. She called after my father died to make sure I was managing. She used the word managing. I told her I was fine. Were you? No. She looked at him steadily. I was completely overwhelmed. I'd been working under my father for 3 years, and I understood the company, and I had a good team, but being competent in a structure and being... The structure are different things. The first 6 months I went home some nights and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could go upstairs. Ethan thought about his first 3 months after Lily's mother left. The specific quality of those nights. Lily finally asleep, the apartment quiet, sitting on the kitchen floor sometimes because the chair felt like too much of a decision. What got you through it? He asked. Work, she said, which is both the true answer and the problematic one. Both things can be true. They often are. She set her menu down. You're very comfortable with ambiguity for someone whose job is essentially about systems working correctly. Systems working correctly requires accepting that they're going to fail in unexpected ways, he said. You build for failure. You plan the redundancy. The ambiguity is the baseline, not the exception. She looked at him with the same quality she'd had in the planning suite hallway. The particular look of someone encountering an angle they hadn't anticipated. Ethan Cross, she said, like she was testing the weight of the name. Who are you? Outside of watching rooms. Single father, he said. Former electrician. Mediocre cook. Good at taking things apart and understanding how they work. He paused. Bad at sleeping. What keeps you up? Lily, sometimes. She had a phase last year where she woke up at 3 a.m., convinced there was a sound in her closet. Turned out to be the heating duct expanding. And when it's not Lily, he looked at her. Same things that keep most people up. Whether I'm doing enough. Whether enough is the right measure. He turned his water glass. After her mother left, I used to run the math every night. Could I give her what she needed? Could I do this alone? Was I going to get it wrong in ways that would matter? What's the answer? The answer is I probably do get things wrong. And she's still okay. He paused. She drew me a picture of balloons last week to celebrate the gala going well. She didn't know exactly what the gala was. She just knew it was important to me, so it was important to her. Victoria was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that happened when something landed and needed room. That sounds like being known, she said. It's the best kind, he said, when it's just real. The waiter came. They ordered. The evening settled into itself. They talked for 3 hours. He learned things. That she'd wanted to study architecture before her father redirected her toward business. That she ran 4 miles every morning, not because she loved running, but because it was the 1 hour of the day when her phone couldn't reasonably reach her. That she'd been to 31 countries on business travel and could tell him the airport and the conference room of each one, but barely the streets. That she couldn't cook anything except pasta and a very specific soup her late grandmother used to make, which she'd spent 2 years reconstructing from memory and still wasn't confident she had right. She learned things, that he'd done electrical apprenticeship straight out of high school, that the event infrastructure work had started as a favor for a contractor friend and become a career. That Lily's full name was Lily June Cross, named for the month she was born. That he read when he could, mostly history and the occasional crime novel. That the one thing he'd learned from the failure of his marriage was that he'd confused someone needing him for someone choosing him, and those were not the same thing. This last thing he said without particular drama, just placed it on the table as a fact, but he watched her receive it, watched the way it registered. Is that something you're still sorting out? She asked. No, he said. I sorted it, but I remember the confusion. She looked at her water glass. Oliver Reese, she said, not like she was making a confession, but like she was being precise. What I told you on Saturday, about the level ground, that's what it was. He needed me, specifically, in a way that felt like being chosen. And then when the company started, when I started being something he couldn't manage the size of, the need went away, and I understood what it had actually been. How long were you together? 14 months? She said it without inflection. He left 2 weeks after my father's diagnosis became public. He said I had changed, which was accurate. I had. He meant it as a failing. Ethan didn't say anything to this. He didn't think it needed anything said to it. He just held her gaze for a moment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I'm not particularly damaged by it, she said, with the specific over-precision of someone making sure a thing is clear. It made me careful. Careful is reasonable, he said. Sometimes it's also a way of not moving. Yeah, he said, it is. The restaurant had thinned around them. They hadn't noticed. The way you didn't notice a room clearing when the conversation in your corner was the thing you were inside of. A busboy was resetting the table 2 spots over. The chalkboard menu in the front was being erased. We should go, she said. Probably. Neither of them moved for another minute. Outside, the harbor was dark and cold, the water visible between the buildings in the distance, black and restless. They stood on the sidewalk without quite completing the departure, the particular liminal space of an evening that has gone well and doesn't know how to be finished. Thank you for dinner, he said. You paid for half. I know. I meant, thank you for the invitation. She looked at him, and her face in the streetlight was the version he'd come to associate with the honest register, without the performance layer, without the operational efficiency. Just her, at 30 years old, standing on a harbor sidewalk with the cold coming off the water. Can I tell you something without it becoming larger than I mean it? She asked. Yeah. I don't do this, she said. I don't sit across from someone for 3 hours and talk about my mother and Oliver Reese and the 6 months I couldn't get out of my car. She paused. I'm not telling you that to make you feel significant, though you should, because you are. I'm telling you because it was unexpected, and I don't entirely know what to do with unexpected. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, okay, in the same way he'd said it to her Saturday night, the same weight, the same measured quality of something being decided. He walked her to her car, not because she needed walking anywhere. She had a driver, a black sedan idling 20 feet down the block, but because the conversation continued to the car, and stopping it earlier felt wrong. They stood at the rear passenger door for another 4 minutes, talking about nothing in particular, the way you did when the actual conversation was the standing there rather than the words. She opened the door, stopped. Thursday worked, she said. It did. I'll call you, she said, which with her wasn't a brush-off. He understood her enough now to know that a statement from her was a commitment, not a social nicety. Okay, he said. She got in. The sedan pulled away. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the taillights reach the corner. He called Carla on the walk back to his car. She picked up on the second ring, because Carla always picked up. It was one of her defining qualities. It's 10:40 on a Thursday, she said, instead of hello. I know. You're never up this late voluntarily. A pause. Did something happen? I had dinner. Silence. Then, with who? He hesitated for exactly 1 second, which Carla, who had known him his entire life and could detect hesitation across 2 time zones, registered immediately. Ethan James Cross, she said. Don't make it something. I'm not making it anything. I'm waiting for you to tell me what it is. He unlocked his car and got in and sat in the dark for a moment, the way he'd described Victoria sitting in her own parking garage 6 months into the hardest year of her life. I don't know what it is, he said. It's something. It might be something. Is she good? Carla asked, and she meant it in the way Carla always meant things, plainly, with the specificity of someone who knew that good was the thing that mattered, and all the other questions were downstream. He thought about 3 hours at a corner table, about the soup her grandmother used to make, about I don't do this, about a woman who had learned to carry everything alone and was, for uncertain reasons, trying to learn what putting something down felt like. Yeah, he said. I think so. Okay, Carla said. That's enough for now. He drove home, picked up Lily from his sister's the next morning. She'd made a macaroni necklace for him, which she draped around his neck in the doorway with the solemnity of a ceremony. He wore it for the rest of the morning without taking it off. The next 3 weeks had a shape that was neither one thing nor another. Victoria called on the following Monday. She called on Thursday again the week after. They had a second dinner that went 2.5 hours, a walk along the harbor afterward in weather that was still too cold for walking by any reasonable standard. She asked about Lily, and he told her things, small things, specific things, the texture of the daily that people shared when they were trying to build a picture of someone's actual life rather than its summary. She listened in the particular way she did everything, with her full attention, no performance. He asked about the Sterling Group. She told him about a board meeting that had gone badly, about a structural decision she'd made over the objections of 2 senior directors who'd been with her father for 12 years and had an investment in his way of doing things. She'd held the decision. The directors had not been pleased. Was it the right call? He asked. Yes, she said. That's almost beside the point, though. The point is, they're going to make the next 3 months harder because of it. Will that change your mind about the decision? She looked at him like the question was slightly absurd. No. Then the 3 months is just 3 months, he said. She had looked at him in a way that he was slowly learning to read, a quiet, specific look that happened when he said something she hadn't heard from other people before, something that came at an angle she hadn't accounted for. They hadn't defined anything. He hadn't tried to. She hadn't offered to. It existed in the space between Thursday and the next contact, in the careful way they were both treating the thing between them, with the particular caution of people who knew from experience what happened when you moved towards something before you were sure of the ground. And then came the afternoon at the Sterling Group offices. She'd asked him to come for what she described as a routine review. The foundation was planning a smaller fundraiser event for mid-June, something intimate compared to the gala, and she wanted his technical assessment of their internal event space, which hadn't been used for a function of that scale before. He came on a Tuesday afternoon. The Sterling Group occupied 3 floors of a glass and concrete building in the financial district, and the lobby had the particular quality of institutional confidence. Nothing shouting, everything placed, the specific design language of an organization that had been around long enough that it no longer needed to announce itself. He was shown to the 4th floor event space, a high-ceilinged room with natural light from east-facing windows, and a ceiling infrastructure that would need to be assessed for rigging capacity. He was doing exactly that, standing on a chair to reach the mounting point, when he heard the corridor outside the glass-walled room become louder. He looked through the glass. There were 5 people in the corridor: Victoria, her assistant Diane, and 3 men in suits that communicated board-level authority. The specific cut and confidence of people who believed that rooms should rearrange themselves in advance of their arrival. The tallest of the 3, silver-haired, was speaking, and even through the glass, Ethan could hear the volume, if not the words. He got down from the chair. He could see Victoria's posture from 20 feet away and through glass, straight, chin level, weight balanced. Her hands were still at her sides, but something in her jaw was tight in the way he'd come to recognize. The particular tension of someone holding a line they couldn't let slip. He couldn't hear the words. He could hear the register. The silver-haired man's voice had the quality of someone who had decided this conversation was a correction rather than a discussion, and who was comfortable with that. Then the door opened. Victoria came in, the 3 men behind her. She saw Ethan, and something in her face registered. Not embarrassment, more like the expression of someone who had been caught holding more weight than they'd wanted a witness for. "Mr. Cross is doing a preliminary assessment of the space," she said to the men, as explanation. "We can continue the conversation in here." The silver-haired man looked at Ethan with the specific variety of polite dismissal that wealthy people sometimes defaulted to with service workers. Not rude exactly, but thoroughly unseeing. "This is a board matter, Victoria," he said. "Perhaps we should find a more appropriate venue." "This is my building, Arthur," she said, and her voice had gone to the specific register Ethan had heard exactly once. In the fire marshal phone call through the door, the very quiet voice that was the loudest thing in the room. "And you're not a board member yet. You're a director. There's a distinction." Arthur's expression shifted. One of the other 2 men moved slightly, the way people moved when they were recalculating their position. "The Meridian acquisition," Arthur said, "is a decision that affects this company's core positioning for the next decade. The board deserves more time. The board has had 6 weeks of analysis and 2 full presentations," Victoria said. I've answered every question that was asked. What you're describing is not more time, it's delay. She held his gaze. The decision is made. Your father would have... Something happened to the air in the room. It was subtle, a change in pressure almost. The particular quality of a moment when something is said that cannot be unsaid, that locates itself precisely at the place where a person is most exposed. Victoria went still. Not the operational stillness she used to project control. Something different, a deeper stillness. The kind that happened when a body was deciding whether to hold or give. Her face didn't collapse. Nothing so visible. But something behind her eyes shifted, and Ethan, who had learned to read this room, saw it. Arthur saw it too. And he was the kind of man who pressed on what he saw. Your father understood that consensus was, "Stop!" The word came from Ethan. Every person in the room looked at him. He hadn't planned it. There was no strategy in it. He'd simply reached the limit of what he could watch without the word coming out. Arthur looked at him with genuine surprise. "Excuse me, I'm not going to say it again," Ethan said, and he met the man's eyes without particular aggression, just steadily. "You've made your point about the decision. Making it again by invoking her father is a different kind of point, and it's not a fair one to make in front of people." The silence in the room had a specific quality, the kind that fell when something unexpected had been said, and no one had yet calculated the correct response. Victoria was looking at him. He couldn't read what was in her face. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. Arthur straightened slightly. When he spoke, it was to Victoria, not to Ethan. "We'll schedule a formal review through the appropriate channels," he said, which was the language of someone retreating while maintaining the form of not having retreated. The three men left. The door closed. Ethan stood in the middle of the event space he'd been hired to assess, with his tablet in his hand and a measuring tape clipped to his belt, and looked at Victoria Sterling. She was looking at the door the men had gone through. "You didn't need to do that," she said. He recognized the phrasing. She'd said it on Saturday night. "You didn't need to do that." About the Hargrove table. He'd told her he knew she had it. He said the same thing now because it was still true. "I know you did." She turned to look at him. In the afternoon light from the east windows, she looked like she had in the parking structure the week of the gala. The composure present, but the layer underneath it visible. The part she didn't show the Arthurs of the world. The part she couldn't entirely hide when the right button had been pressed. "He does that," she said, "in meetings. When I hold a decision he disagrees with, he brings up my father. As a strategy." Her voice was even. "It works sometimes. It's not that I can't answer it. I can answer it, but it takes something out of me to answer it every time." "Because it's not actually about the decision," Ethan said. "No," she said. "It never is." He set his tablet down on the nearest chair. He crossed the room, not all the way to her, just closer, closing the distance enough that they were talking like two people rather than two people across a room. "Victoria," he said, "you ran the most successful gala this foundation has produced. You made a call on a billion-dollar acquisition that you are apparently sufficiently confident in to hold against director-level opposition. You built or rebuilt or sustained every program outcome that woman talked about at the microphone Saturday night." He paused. "Arthur is afraid of you. That's what's actually happening." She looked at him. "Directors who are confident in the leadership above them," he said, "don't spend board reviews invoking the previous leader." Something in her face moved. Slowly, the way a thing moved when it had been held in one position for a long time, and was cautiously testing whether it could go another way. "You watch rooms," she said. "I watch rooms," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took one careful breath, and the held thing in her posture released, not dramatically, not in any way that anyone watching from outside would have noticed, just a degree of softness returning to her shoulders, a slight adjustment in the set of her jaw. "The ceiling mounting point on the east wall," she said, glancing up at it. "Will it hold a rig?" "I need to check the backing structure," he said, "but probably yes." "Good." She picked up the portfolio she'd set down when the men came in. "Let's finish the assessment." He picked up his tablet. They worked in the quiet of the room for another 40 minutes, and what happened in those 40 minutes was small and specific, and not particularly dramatic. Just two people doing work in the same space. and the thing between them continuing to become itself at the rate it was going to become itself, which was not fast, but was real. She didn't call that Thursday. Ethan noticed it the way you noticed a sound stopping rather than starting. An absence where a pattern had been, which was somehow louder than the thing itself. He didn't call her either. He told himself he was giving her room, which was true. And he told himself he wasn't worried about what the silence meant, which was less true. He put in a full week of work at Alderview, running a pre-installation assessment for a corporate conference coming in mid-May. He took Lily to her Saturday soccer game, where she played with the specific chaotic enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who understood approximately 40% of the rules and compensated with pure effort. He cooked dinner twice, burned it once. He had a beer with Marcus on Friday evening at the bar, 2 blocks from the storage facility, and Marcus, who had noticed the Thursday call pattern because Marcus noticed everything, did not ask about it directly, but did say, "You seem like someone who's waiting for a phone to ring," which was accurate enough that Ethan didn't try to argue with it. On the following Monday, 12 days after the Sterling Group office visit, Diane, Victoria's assistant, emailed him a document, a formal contract offer, Sterling Foundation, for the June fundraiser event. Technical crew supervisor. Scope of work detailed. Rate above his standard. Professional. Clean. The kind of document that drew a very specific line between 2 kinds of relationships and suggested one of them had been decided upon. He read it twice. Then he called the number he had, not the VS initials number, the regular one, and she picked up on the 3rd ring. "I got the contract," he said. A beat. "Good. Diane handles those." "I know Diane handles them." He paused. "Victoria." Another beat. "Ethan." What happened? It wasn't a question. He'd learned her phrasing habits well enough to use them back, make it a statement, remove the interrogative, see if certainty of form produced honesty of content. She was quiet for 4 seconds, which was long for her. "The Reese situation became public," she said. It's nothing new. He gave an interview, a business publication. He commented on the Meridian acquisition. He suggested the decision reflected inexperience rather than strategy and implied he had proximity to the inner workings. A pause. "He was careful about it. He didn't use my name directly." "But people who know will know," Ethan said. "People who know already know about us. About the relationship 2 years ago. They'll connect it. And if you and I are—" She stopped, started again. "If there's something between us that becomes visible, and Reese is actively positioning himself as someone with inside knowledge of my judgment, then anything involving the 2 of us becomes material for the same narrative." Ethan sat with that for a moment. He was in his car in the resort parking lot, engine off, the mid-morning quiet around him. "So the contract," he said, "it keeps the professional relationship clearly defined. It protects you," he said. Not harshly, just plainly. "Yes," she said, and he respected that she didn't dress it up. "It protects me. And it protects you, honestly. If this gets complicated publicly and you're named as someone close to me, it could affect your work, your contracts. I didn't ask you to protect me." "I know you didn't." "Victoria." He looked out through the windshield at the resort service entrance, at the ordinary Tuesday morning activity of the building they'd both spent a high-pressure week inside of, which felt like a different era. "I'm not Oliver Reese. I'm not going to give an interview. I know that." "Then what are you actually afraid of?" The silence this time was different. Not calculating. Something closer to the qualities she'd had in the parking garage at the gala. The concrete barrier, the blazer off, the controlled distance temporarily missing. "That it works," she said, and the words came out flat and careful, in the specific register of something that had been true for a while before being said. "That it actually works, and I let myself, and then it doesn't, for whatever reason, and I've let someone see all the way in, and there's no clean way back from that." He didn't answer immediately. He thought about what she'd said in the restaurant. "I don't do this." Thought about the soup she'd been reconstructing from memory for 2 years. Thought about a woman who ran 4 miles every morning, partly because it was the 1 hour nobody could reach her. "That's not a reason to send me a contract," he said. "That's a reason to have a conversation." She didn't say anything. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'm not building towards something I plan to use against you. And I can't promise you that it works out. I can't promise you that about anything. But sending Diane's contract instead of calling me is not the same as being careful. It's just a neater way to be afraid." The line was quiet for long enough that he thought she might have pulled back into the composed operational mode that was her most reliable defensive formation. Then she said quietly, "I hate that you can do that." "Do what?" "Say the true thing, simply, like it's not hard." "It's hard," he said. "I've just had practice." Another pause. "Can I think?" she said. "For a few days. I'm not asking you to wait indefinitely. I just need to sit with it without the pressure of the next step." "Yes," he said. "Think." "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Call me when you're done thinking." He hung up, sat in the parking lot for another 2 minutes, then went inside and did his job. She called 6 days later, on a Thursday, which he noticed. "Are you free Sunday?" she said. "Not dinner, I want to do something ordinary." "What counts as ordinary?" "I don't entirely know," she said. "That's partly the point." They went to a farmer's market on the east side of the harbor district, her idea, which surprised him because it was not the kind of venue he'd have associated with her, and he said so. "I used to go," she said, moving through the stall rows with her hands in her jacket pockets, no assistant, no phone in hand. Before everything got structured. My grandmother lived 3 blocks from a market like this, Saturday mornings." "The soup grandmother?" She glanced at him sideways. "You remember that." "I remember most of what you tell me." She was quiet for a moment, and then she stopped at a produce stall and spent 4 minutes talking to the farmer about the difference between 2 varieties of winter squash, with the particular focused interest she brought to everything: full attention, actual curiosity, and the farmer, a weathered woman in her 60s who had clearly seen a lot of Sunday browsers who didn't actually care about squash, visibly registered that this customer was different. Victoria bought 2 squash and tucked them under her arm. "I have no idea how to cook these," she said, walking away. "I can teach you," he said, which was not something he'd planned to offer, but was true. He made a decent roasted squash. It was one of the things he'd figured out for Lily's dinners. You couldn't really ruin it. She looked at him. "You cook." I said I was a mediocre cook. Squash is within my mediocre range. "When? When do you have a night free?" She thought about it. "Thursday?" "Thursday works." They walked the rest of the market, and it was ordinary in the way she'd said she wanted it to be, which turned out to be not simple but specific. She was not good at unstructured time. He could see her notice this about herself, the way she'd reach for her phone out of habit and then consciously not take it out, the way she over-organized her attention on the stalls as if browsing could be optimized. She was trying to let a thing be loose that had been tight for a long time, and it didn't come naturally, and she was doing it anyway. He didn't point any of this out. He walked beside her and bought a bag of early strawberries and ate one and gave her one and said, "These are better than they have any right to be in April." And she ate hers and said, "They're good." And that was a whole thing, just that. But Thursday, his apartment. He told Lily in advance because Lily deserved advance notice about things, and because 6-year-olds who didn't get advance notice about changes in routine could produce a particular species of social chaos that was incompatible with the evening he was attempting. "A lady is coming for dinner," he said. Lily looked up from the drawing she was working on. It appeared to be a horse, though its proportions were impressionistic. "What lady?" "Her name is Victoria. She's someone Dad works with sometimes. She's going to learn how to cook squash." "She doesn't know how to cook squash?" "Not yet." Lily considered this with the philosophical gravity that 6-year-olds occasionally deployed when they sensed a situation was significant. "Okay," she said. "I can show her my horse." The horse was still in progress, he noted. He didn't mention this. Victoria arrived at 6:15, which was on time by anyone's measure, and she was carrying the 2 squash from the market in a canvas bag and wearing jeans and a simple dark sweater, and she looked different again in the way she was always different when the context shifted. More uncertain. The professional composer had no scaffolding to attach to in a small apartment that smelled like garlic and had a child's drawings magnetized to the refrigerator. Lily came out of her room at the sound of the door. The two of them looked at each other, the 30-year-old billionaire and the 6-year-old with paint on her left hand, and Lily said with total directness, "Do you like horses?" Victoria said, "Yes, I had a horse when I was young." Lily's eyes went wide. "A real one?" Her name was Maple. She was bay-colored. Do you know what bay means? Brown, Lily said, because she'd been through a horse phase 6 months ago that had required Ethan to learn more about horse terminology than he'd anticipated. Brown with a black mane, Victoria confirmed, and she was very opinionated about apples. She would only eat the red kind. Lily thought about this. "That's smart," she said. "Red ones are better." Then she grabbed Victoria's hand, unselfconsciously, the way 6-year-olds grabbed hands without calculating whether it was welcome, and pulled her toward the kitchen table. "Come see my horse. I'm not done, but you can see it." Ethan stood in his own kitchen doorway and watched Victoria Sterling be pulled by the hand by his daughter, and something happened in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for, only that it was real, and it was located somewhere below rational consideration. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and looked at Lily's horse drawing with complete attention. "I think the legs are very good," she said. "The head is wrong," Lily said critically. "It's too big." "Maple had a big head. Some horses do." Lily looked at this angle. "Maybe it's a maple horse," she decided, and picked up a crayon and added something to the drawing with new conviction. Ethan went back to the kitchen and started on the squash. So he taught her to cut the squash, which required negotiating around the fact that she held a knife with the same precision she held everything correctly by technical standard, but had no instinct for how produce actually needed to be handled, the feel of when something was resisting correctly versus when the angle was wrong. She was bad at it initially and didn't pretend otherwise, which he appreciated. "You're fighting it," he said. "I'm being precise." Precision isn't the same as feel. You need to find where it wants to split. He moved her hand slightly, adjusted the angle. "There. Try now." The squash split cleanly. "Huh," she said. "Cooking is mostly feel," he said. "You can follow the recipe exactly, and it'll be wrong because you didn't account for how the produce actually is today, which is different from how it was in the recipe test kitchen. You're describing improvisation within a system." "I guess I am." "That's what you do at events," she said. "The system is the plan. The improvisation is everything that happens to the plan." "That's a reasonable way to describe it." She looked at the squash. "I'm not good at improvisation." "You improvised the entire permit situation on 4 hours' notice," he said. "That's different. That's problem solving. Improvisation implies not minding the uncertainty." "I mind it." "You can mind it and still do it," he said. "Most people mind it." Lily appeared at the kitchen doorway. "Can I help?" "You can put the olive oil on," Ethan told her. Lily climbed onto her step stool with the focused competence of a child who knew exactly where the olive oil was and what her role in this operation looked like. She drizzled it over the cut squash with careful, exaggerated concentration. Victoria watched her. Her expression was something Ethan couldn't fully read. Something soft and slightly careful, the look of someone encountering a thing they hadn't prepared for and were trying to receive without making it into more than it was. "She's very confident," Victoria said quietly to Ethan. "She gets that from Carla," he said. "My sister. Lily spends enough time with her that some of it transferred." "And from you," Victoria said. "The way she just, took my hand. She decided I was safe. She didn't think about it." "Kids do that." "Not all of them," she said. "I didn't. I was a very cautious child." A pause. "I'm still a very cautious person." "I know," he said. "Is that—" She stopped, started differently. "Is that a problem for you?" He set down the dish he was holding, looked at her across the small kitchen, a genuinely small kitchen, the kind of kitchen that made proximity unavoidable. "No," he said. "It's who you are. I'm not interested in a different version of you." She looked at him for a moment, and in the warm overhead light of his small kitchen that smelled like garlic and olive oil and the particular domestic life he'd built from the pieces available to him, she looked like someone arriving somewhere they hadn't known they were trying to reach. Then Lily said, "Is it done?" with the impatience of someone for whom the philosophical implications of squash preparation were secondary to the squash, and they both came back to the kitchen and the ordinary business of making dinner. The dinner was good, not perfect. He'd over-seasoned the squash slightly, which Lily noticed immediately because she was apparently his most reliable kitchen critic, and Victoria's pasta contribution, which she'd made from scratch as her one established competency, had a texture issue she diagnosed aloud with the exacting self-assessment of an engineer reviewing their own work. But the three of them ate at his small table, and the conversation had the shape of an actual evening. Lily talking about the horse drawing and a friend at school named Priya, and a book she was reading about dolphins. Victoria asking questions and listening to the answers with genuine interest, and occasionally contributing information about horses that made Lily periodically say, "Really?" with the tone of someone updating their database in real time. After dinner, Lily fell asleep on the couch before Ethan had finished the dishes. This was not unusual. She ran at full capacity until she didn't, like a device that went from 60% battery to off without the warning signs. He carried her to her room and came back to find Victoria drying the dishes he'd washed, which he hadn't asked her to do. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I'm aware." She kept drying. "She's wonderful, Ethan." "She is." I want to be careful about how I say this." She set down the dish, turned to face him, her back against the counter. "I wasn't expecting tonight. I expected dinner with you, and I knew Lily would be here, but I wasn't expecting what tonight actually felt like." What did it feel like? She considered the question with the particular seriousness she brought to things she was uncertain how to answer. Like something I've been adjacent to for a long time without understanding what I was next to. She met his eyes. "That sounds opaque." "No," he said. "I think I understand it. She looked at her hands for a moment. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she said. I don't mean tonight specifically. I mean the shape of it, the ongoing shape. My life isn't set up for—" She stopped. "That sounds like I'm making excuses." "You're telling the truth," he said, "which is different." "I don't want to get into something with you and then have my life eat it," she said. And it came out more exposed than anything she'd said before, the careful precision momentarily gone, just the real concern underneath it. "Because my life does that. It has a way of consuming everything that isn't specifically reinforced against it." He moved closer, not to close the distance entirely, just enough to change the quality of the conversation, make it something that didn't have to travel across the room. "Then we reinforce it," he said. "It's not that simple." "I didn't say it was simple. I said we reinforce it." He held her gaze. "Victoria, I'm not asking you to fix your life to have room for me. I'm asking you to not decide preemptively that there's no room." She looked at him for a long moment. "I sent you the contract," she said. "I know. That was me deciding preemptively." "Yeah," he said. "It was." She exhaled slowly. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I want to be clear that I know I'm not good at this." "Nobody's good at it," he said. "You just keep doing it anyway." She reached out and picked up his hand, not dramatically, just picked it up, looked at it for a second. The working hand of someone whose job was physical, with the particular calluses and small scars that accumulated from years of that work. She held it for a moment. "Thursday," she said. "That's apparently our day." "Apparently," he said. "Then Thursday," she said, like it was a decision, which it was. She stayed another half hour. They talked on the couch about nothing particularly important, about whether she'd managed to reconstruct the correct soup yet. She hadn't. About a roof repair his building had been delaying for 8 months that was finally happening next week. About a book she'd started on the recommendation of a foundation board member and wasn't sure about the red apples maple the horse had preferred. The conversation had the quality of people who had stopped auditioning for each other and were just talking. When she left, he walked her down to the building entrance. The driver was at the corner. She stopped at the door, turned. The squash was good, she said. It was overseasoned. Slightly. Still good. She held his gaze. Thank you for tonight. All of it. Lily's going to talk about maple for the next 2 weeks, he said. Good, she said, and something in the word had warmth in it that was unguarded in a way she'd been carefully rationing. She left. He went back upstairs, checked on Lily, who was a starfish in her bed with one arm reaching toward the edge, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his daughter in the room she was growing in, and felt the particular thing you felt when life was asking to expand in a direction you hadn't blueprinted. The weeks that followed found their own shape, irregular, imperfect, maintained through the specific effort of two people who were both, in their different ways, out of the habit of making room for another person. She traveled twice in the following 3 weeks: Singapore for a partnership summit, Chicago for a foundation board review. He tracked it not in a monitoring way, but in the way you track the movement of something that had become relevant to your landscape. She called from the Singapore hotel at an hour that suggested she'd miscalculated the time zone difference, which she admitted directly when he picked up, sounding half asleep. I've been awake for 20 hours and I forgot to account for the 14-hour gap. I can call back tomorrow. I'm up, he said, because he was, more or less. How is it? Sterile, she said. The room is very nice and has no personality. I've been in it for 4 hours, and I've already moved all the furniture 6 inches from where it was because the arrangement wasn't functional. He smiled in the dark of his bedroom. You rearranged the hotel furniture. Only the desk and the side table. The main furniture is bolted. That seems like a you problem. It is entirely a me problem, she said, and there was something in her voice, the looseness of exhaustion, the hour, the physical distance, that had let a quality through that she usually maintained more guard over. Something warmer, less constructed. They talked for 30 minutes about nothing that mattered. He told her about Lily's school art project, which involved paper mache and had resulted in a situation in his bathroom that he hadn't fully resolved. She told him about a board dinner where a senior partner had spent 40 minutes explaining an industry she ran to her face without appearing to notice the irony. He told her that sounded exhausting. She said, "It was clarifying, actually. People show you who they are if you let them talk long enough." He thought about Arthur and Oliver Reese and agreed. She said before she hung up, "I'm better at this when you're not in front of me." At what? Saying things. A pause. "I think I need the distance to take the stakes down." "You want I should call you from another room?" She laughed. A real one. Unguarded, the kind that happened past midnight after 20 hours awake. He filed that sound somewhere careful. "Maybe," she said. "Good night, Ethan." "Get some sleep," he said. "Move the furniture back before you check out." "Absolutely not," she said, and hung up. She brought him something from Chicago, a small architecture book, the city's significant buildings, photographs, and structural histories. He hadn't mentioned architecture to her directly, but he'd mentioned, in the course of various Thursday conversations, that he'd always been interested in how buildings worked on the inside, the engineering that supported the visible form. She'd remembered, filed it, acted on it without making a production of it. He turned it over in his hands for a moment when she gave it to him, not sure what to do with the specific feeling of being paid attention to. "You said you found structural systems interesting," she said, and she said it practically, the way she did things that mattered to her while maintaining the tone of things that didn't. "I did," he said. "I noticed a bookshop near the conference hotel." A pause. "I'm not good at... I don't usually..." She stopped, tried differently. "It seemed like something you'd want." "It is," he said. "Thank you." She nodded once, moved on to something else in the conversation. He put the book on his shelf between the crime novel he'd been working through for 3 weeks and a manual on electrical systems that dated back to his apprenticeship days. He thought about the soup she'd been reconstructing from memory for 2 years, about bringing the right thing to the right person, even when you weren't sure how. He thought about all the forms that caring took when you were out of practice with it. Imprecise, slightly clumsy at the edges, real in the middle. The handwritten note came the following week, slipped under his apartment door on a Wednesday evening. He didn't know how she'd gotten into his building, suspected she'd probably asked the super in a way the super found impossible to refuse. Folded once, no envelope, his name on the outside in her precise handwriting. I keep starting this in my head and then editing it into nothing. So, I'm glad it was you specifically who walked into that terrace on Monday morning. I don't think it would have been the same with someone else. That's the whole thing. He read it at his kitchen table with the overhead light on and the apartment quiet around him, Lily asleep in her room, the building settling into its nighttime sounds. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got a piece of paper from the kitchen drawer, plain paper, the kind that came in the printer, and wrote, "I know, me too," and his name, and walked downstairs and found the overnight envelope service address she'd once mentioned was her preferred courier, and sent it. It wasn't much. But it was the true thing, simply said. That had always been enough between them. The June fundraiser came together the way things came together when the people involved already knew how to work. Without the compressed panic of the gala week, without the late-night permit emergencies and the vendor cancellations and the structural anchor variants that had started all of this. Ethan's crew had the Sterling Group's fourth-floor event space rigged and tested 2 days ahead of schedule. The room looked good. Not the sweeping bay view drama of the Grand Terrace, but something more intimate. 100 guests instead of 240. A warmer register. The kind of event where conversations could actually happen rather than the ceremonial proximity of assigned seating at large round tables. He saw more of Victoria in the 2 weeks before the fundraiser than he had in any sustained stretch since the gala. Not romantically, or not only, mostly in the functional way of two people working toward the same end, which was its own kind of closeness. The kind he'd come to understand was actually how they'd started. They had a language built from Monday mornings and service corridors and the specific vocabulary of problems solved under pressure. That language didn't go away when the context changed. It just meant something different now. She was different too, in ways that were small enough to miss if you weren't looking and obvious if you were. She ate lunch. Not every day. She was still capable of working through an afternoon on coffee and forward momentum, but enough that it was no longer the exception he'd cataloged in that first week. She had, on 2 occasions, asked him to recommend something from the building's deli counter. He'd told her the turkey sandwich was still the call. She'd gotten a different one, which seemed right. She left the office at a reasonable hour 3 times in the 2 weeks he tracked, which he did not tell her he was doing. He knew because her driver mentioned it to the building's lobby attendant, and the lobby attendant mentioned it to the resort's event liaison, and the event liaison mentioned it to Marcus, and Marcus mentioned it to Ethan with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information without commentary. Marcus's careful neutrality on the subject of Victoria Sterling had become one of the more quietly entertaining features of Ethan's recent life. The thing between them had found a rhythm that was neither rushed nor stalled. Thursday evenings, mostly. Occasional phone calls that started about logistics and migrated into something else. A Sunday morning when she came to his neighborhood and they walked to the same farmer's market and she bought another squash she probably couldn't cook, which he thought was deliberate, a small private joke she was making to herself. Lily had asked about Maple the horse 3 more times since the dinner, which Victoria had been told about, and which had produced in her the particular expression he associated with something catching her off guard in a way she didn't want to recover from too quickly. It was not a perfect thing. It was interrupted and imperfect, and sometimes awkward in the way that things were when 2 people were genuinely trying to fit into each other's actual lives, rather than a simplified version of them. She was not always available when he wanted to talk. He was not always available when she needed someone to be present. She still overstructured things sometimes, defaulted to the professional register when the personal one would have been more honest, caught herself doing it, and occasionally did it anyway because some habits were longer than the desire to break them. He had his own version, a tendency to withhold things he was uncertain about, to watch and assess when he should have just said the thing, which she had called him on twice in terms that were clear and not unkind. But they kept showing up. That was the thing. They kept being in the room together and trying and adjusting and not using the difficulty as a reason to leave, which Ethan had come to understand was the whole of it, really. The whole of what made something real rather than convenient. The fundraiser was on a Friday evening in mid-June. Ethan had his team in the space by noon for final activation. By 4 o'clock, the room was fully operational. The lighting design running at test levels, the audio calibrated, the staging clean. He did his last walkthrough at 5:15 and signed off without finding a single item requiring adjustment, which was the kind of thing that made him vaguely suspicious, because in his experience, a clean final walkthrough usually meant the problem hadn't surfaced yet. He was stowing his tablet in the service corridor when Diane found him. "Ms. Sterling asked me to give you this," Diane said, and handed him an envelope. He looked at it, his name in Victoria's handwriting. "She's with the donors," Diane said, and left. He opened it in the service corridor, standing under the flat fluorescent light where he'd first heard Victoria's voice through a half-open door 6 months ago. The specific register of someone holding a line that was getting harder to hold. The note inside was short. Her precise handwriting, one side of a small card. "Your contract officially ends tonight. I wanted to mark that. What comes after tonight is not a contract. It's a choice. For both of us. No obligations, no professional framework, no built-in reason to be in the same room. Just whether we want to be. I find that I want to be. I thought you should know before the evening started, rather than after." He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he folded the card, put it in his shirt pocket, and went to complete his pre-event checklist. The evening ran clean. The intimacy of the smaller event produced a different quality than the gala's scale. Conversations that had actual depth to them, donors who seemed to be genuinely engaging with the Foundation's program staff rather than performing engagement. A speaker presentation that ran 10 minutes over schedule because the questions from the floor were real, and Victoria, instead of managing the time with the firm hand she normally brought to program flow, simply let it run because the conversation was worth more than the schedule. He watched her from the side of the room, the way he'd watched her at the gala, through glass or around corners. Except this time there was no glass. No corner. Just the distance he maintained because his job kept him at the room's edges and not its center. She moved through the evening with the quality he'd seen developing over weeks. Still precise, still deeply competent, still the person who knew where every problem was before it became one. But there was something less rigid in it. She stopped longer at conversations than she used to. She laughed, twice, at things that were genuinely funny rather than in the social way. When a program director said something unexpected that delighted her, it showed in her face before she had time to decide whether to show it. Small things, enormous things, depending on where you'd been standing at the beginning. He was checking the power routing on the west wall when he heard the voice. Not loud, contained, private. The practiced low tone of a man who'd learned to make his statements feel like intimacies. Ethan had heard it once before, at a gala table, through ambient room noise. It had a specific quality he recognized on instinct. He turned. Oliver Reese was standing near the donor registration table, which meant he'd been cleared as a guest. The Foundation's fundraiser guest list wasn't restricted to the gala's tier, and Reese had presumably leveraged whatever professional adjacency gave him access. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of man who wore his money quietly but thoroughly, and he was talking to someone at the table with the ease of a person who knew how to be comfortable in any room. And then Victoria came out of a conversation across the room, turned, and saw him. The distance was too great for Ethan to see her expression in detail. What he could see was the quality of her pause, the specific hesitation of encountering something you hadn't prepared for, the half-second of recalibration before the composure came back up. Reese saw her, moved toward her. Ethan stayed where he was. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. He stayed where he was because this was not his conversation, not his intervention to make. He'd said what he needed to say about Oliver Reese in a service corridor 6 months ago. Noise, from someone who knows which button to press. And he believed it, and more importantly, he believed in her ability to handle what was in front of her now. He'd believed it in the Sterling group corridor when Arthur had played his trump card, and she'd gone still and he'd stepped in. And even then, even in that moment, he'd known it was not because she couldn't handle it. It was because she shouldn't have to alone. This was different. This was hers. He watched. Quotes. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. He tracked it on the wall clock because he was close enough to a wall clock. What he could see from across the room, Victoria standing with her weight balanced, chin level, the posture he associated with her holding her own space. Reese speaking, and the particular way he leaned slightly forward. The same stance Ethan had noted at the gala, the man trying to reclaim proximity. Victoria's expression controlled, but something different underneath it than there had been at the gala. At the gala, she'd gone to the kitchen corridor afterward. The weight of it had been visible on her. This time she was different. He couldn't hear the words. He could read the conversation in the bodies the way his job had trained him to read rooms. At some point, roughly 6 minutes in, Victoria said something that made Reese's forward lean stop. He straightened. She said something else. Reese's face rearranged itself into the particular expression of someone who had expected a familiar dynamic and found a different one. There was a moment of stillness. Then Victoria turned and moved away, back toward the center of the room, and Reese stood at the edge of the space for a moment before finding someone else to speak to. She came back through the room on the way to the speaker platform for the evening's closing remarks, and she passed within 20 feet of Ethan, and she looked at him directly. Briefly, in passing, with an expression that said something he didn't need to translate. He nodded once. She went to the platform. Her closing remarks were 4 minutes long and were, in Ethan's assessment, the best he'd heard her give. Not because they were more polished or better structured than the gala speech. She'd always been a clean speaker, but because there was something in them that hadn't been there before. A specific, undefended directness, like someone who had stopped trying to prove something and was just saying what was true. "My father built something worth sustaining," she said, near the end. "I spent the first 2 years after his death being terrified that I wasn't enough to sustain it. I want to tell you that what I've learned in that time is that being enough isn't a static state. It's a practice. You have to keep choosing it, even when it's inconvenient, even when people tell you the choosing is wrong, even when your own voice is the loudest one saying you should stop." She paused. "The work this foundation does is a practice. Every year, we choose it again. Thank you for being the people who choose it with us." The room applauded, not the polite applause of social obligation, the kind with weight in it, with recognition of something real having been said. Ethan clapped from the side of the room and didn't try to do anything with the thing happening in his chest. By 10:30, the guests were gone and the breakdown had begun. His crew worked the decommission with the quiet efficiency of people who'd been at this long enough that it didn't require oversight. Marcus calling the equipment sequencing, the other crew members running the cable pack down, everything moving in the practiced rhythm of a team that trusted each other's judgment. Ethan walked the perimeter, doing his final check, making sure nothing was getting left or damaged, signing off on each section as it cleared. He was finishing the south end when he heard the lounge door open. The fourth-floor building had a small lounge adjacent to the event space, the kind of room that served as a waiting area or informal meeting space, with low chairs and a window ledge that looked east toward the harbor district. During the event week's planning sessions, it had become a de facto overflow workspace, and at some point it had come to feel like a neutral territory between the two of them. Neither his space nor hers, just a room they both happened to occupy when the immediate pressure had lifted enough to stand still. Victoria was sitting on the window ledge, her shoes off, one leg drawn up, looking at the city lights through the glass. She'd taken her hair down at some point in the last hour. She had a glass of water on the ledge beside her. She looked exhausted in the genuine physical way. The way you looked when you'd been running at capacity for an extended period, and the extended period was finally ending. She also looked lighter than he'd ever seen her. "Event's done," he said. "I know." She didn't look away from the window. "Is your team okay to finish?" "Marcus has it." "Sit down," she said, not like an instruction, more like an invitation she wasn't sure how to make sound like one. He pulled a chair close to the window ledge and sat. The city below was in its late evening register, the office lights thinning out, the restaurant district still active, the harbor a dark distance with its running lights, and the occasional slow movement of a vessel. "He asked me if I'd made a mistake," she said. "Oliver." That was the shape of it, phrased as concern. He said the Meridian acquisition was being watched closely by people he had access to, and that if the numbers in the first quarter didn't support the decision, I would be in a difficult position, and he wanted to make sure I had the right advisors around me. She paused. He meant himself. He was offering himself as the right advisor. "What did you say?" I said the Meridian acquisition had already produced 2 partnership commitments in the first 60 days that weren't part of the original projected outcomes, and that the first quarter numbers were ahead of the conservative benchmark, and that if his sources had different information, he should probably update his sources. She looked at her water glass, and then I said I hoped he had a good evening. That's it? That's it. She looked at him. I used to rehearse things. Against him specifically. I would run the conversations in advance, all the possible versions, try to prepare for every angle. She shook her head slightly. Tonight I didn't prepare anything. I just said what was true. How was that? Easier, she said, and sounded genuinely surprised by it. It was easier than any of the prepared versions. He looked at her for a moment. The weight-bearing wall thing, he tried it? He tried something close to it. He mentioned my father in a general way, something about my father's advisory circle and whether I'd maintained those relationships. She met his eyes. I didn't freeze. I noticed I didn't freeze. Good, Ethan said. It sounds small when I say it. It's not small, he said. I was in the room the first time. I know the difference. She was quiet for a moment, looking back at the city. The room behind them was nearly cleared. He could hear Marcus's voice giving directions, the systematic sounds of equipment being packed, the ordinary industry of finishing. My contract ended tonight, she said. I got your note. And? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. And I drove here this morning to do my job, which I did, and now my job is done and I'm sitting here anyway. He looked at her. That answer the question? She almost smiled. Could have just said yes. I could have, he agreed. But that's the version with the detail, and the detail is the point. She reached into the pocket of her jacket, which was draped over the window ledge beside her, and produced something folded. He recognized it before she unfolded it, the planning sheet from the Grand Terrace, the master document from the Gala Week, annotated in multiple pens, the edges worn from being handled and folded and carried. He didn't know she'd kept it. She unfolded it carefully and held it so the light from the window fell across the top corner. After Saturday. Her handwriting. The 2 words in the corner of a page that had otherwise been a record of problems and solutions and adjustments and the specific, relentless work of making something real from a plan. I carried this for 6 months, she said. Not consciously, not as a... I put it in a file folder and forgot about it, and then found it when I was clearing the Gala archive. She smoothed it with her thumb. When I wrote it, I didn't have a clear idea of what I was saying. I knew I wanted to say something. I knew I couldn't say it in any form that required addressing that night. She looked at it. I think I was afraid that if I named it directly, the naming would make it visible to everyone in the room, including me. What does it mean? He asked. The same question he'd asked her the night of the gala, in the quiet of the terrace when the guests had thinned and the bay had gone dark. She'd answered it then. He wanted to hear how the answer had changed. She looked up from the sheet. It meant, after Saturday, there are no job titles, no framework, no reason we have to be in the same room that isn't just us choosing to be in the same room. She paused. It meant I wanted to find out who you were without the structure. And I was afraid of wanting that, so I wrote it down instead of saying it, because writing it felt smaller. It wasn't smaller, he said. No, she said. It wasn't. The lounge was quiet around them, the event space beyond it now nearly silent. Marcus would have it cleared in 20 minutes, Ethan estimated, which meant he had 20 minutes in which his professional obligations were technically complete, and what remained was purely the question of what happened next. I want to tell you something, he said, that I've been carrying for a while. She looked at him. When Lily's mother left, he said, the thing that took longest to recover wasn't the practical stuff. The practical stuff was survivable. It was hard, but it was solvable. You make the adjustments, you find the structure, you figure out the new economy of your life. He paused. What took longer was trusting my own read of people, because I had gotten it wrong in the specific direction that cost the most. I'd confused being needed for being wanted, and I'd built a whole life around something that turned out to be a different thing than I thought. You said that at dinner, she said. The first dinner. I know. I'm telling you the rest of it. He held her gaze. The rest is that I don't have that confusion with you. I know the difference now between what you need, which is real, and I'm not dismissing it. You need things. Everyone does. And what you actually want. He said it carefully, deliberately. And I know that you're still working out whether you're allowed to want things that don't have a justifiable return on investment. She was very still. You're allowed, he said. That's the thing I've been carrying. That I wanted to wait until the contract was done and the structure was gone and there was nothing left to attribute it to, and then tell you you're allowed to want something just because it's good. Not because it's strategic, not because it proves something, because it's good and it's yours. The city lights were steady through the window. Somewhere below, a car horn, one brief, ordinary note of urban sound, and then the quiet came back. Victoria looked at the planning sheet in her hands. She looked at the two words in the corner. Then she set it carefully on the window ledge beside her water glass and looked at Ethan. I talked to my mother last week, she said. He waited. She called, not for a birthday, not because she'd seen something in the press. She just called. A pause. We talked for 40 minutes. It wasn't a resolution of anything. 15 years of distance doesn't resolve in 40 minutes. But she asked how I actually was, and I didn't say fine. She looked at her hands. I told her about the Meridian acquisition and what it had cost me in the boardroom, and then I told her I'd been having dinner with someone, a man who works with his hands and has a 6-year-old daughter who names horses after produce. She almost smiled. My mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Does he make you feel steady?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Then pay attention to that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Smart woman," he said. "She has her moments." Victoria looked at him directly. "You make me feel steady, Ethan, not because you fix things. You don't fix things. You're very careful not to fix things without being asked, which I noticed, and which matters. Because you're just there. You're honest. You don't perform anything for me, and you don't ask me to perform anything for you." She paused. "I've been in rooms full of people my entire adult life and felt completely alone in most of them. I don't feel that way when you're in the room." He looked at her for a long moment. "There's something I have to ask," he said. "Okay." "Lily," he said it simply, not as a complication, as a reality. "She's the most important fact of my life. Whatever this becomes, she's in it, not on the edges. She's in it. And I need to know that's something you're actually choosing, not something you're tolerating because the rest of it is good." Victoria didn't answer immediately. He respected that. The pause was real, not performed. The pause of someone taking a question seriously rather than answering it with the first available response. "At dinner," she said finally, "the night I came to your apartment, when she fell asleep on the couch and you carried her to her room." She stopped. "I stood in your kitchen drying dishes, and I thought, this is what I didn't know I was adjacent to. Not an abstraction, specifically her. The way she looked at the horse drawing like it was genuinely important, the way she grabbed my hand without thinking about it, the way she told me red apples were the smart choice, completely serious." She met his eyes. "I'm not tolerating anything. I'm telling you that your 6-year-old daughter has already made a place in something I didn't know had room." He breathed. "Okay," he said. "Is that enough?" "More than," he said. She reached out and took his hand the way she'd done in his kitchen. Just picked it up, held it. The working hand, the calluses, the small scar along the index finger from a cable splice that had slipped 2 years ago. She'd looked at it that night like she was reading something. He'd wondered what. "What comes after tonight," she said, echoing her own note, "is a choice." "Yeah," he said. "I'm choosing," she said, "in case that's not clear." "It's clear," he said. "I've been choosing since the parking garage." She looked at him. "The parking garage. The concrete barrier, your blazer off. You looked like a person instead of a role for about 3 minutes, and that was when I understood what I was dealing with." She was quiet for a moment. "What were you dealing with?" "Someone I was going to have trouble leaving alone," he said. She laughed. The real one. The unguarded one he'd heard on the phone from Singapore. The one that came in past midnight when the walls were down. It was, he thought, one of the better sounds he could think of. I tried to send you a contract, she said. You did? That was very stupid. It was a little stupid, he allowed. You should have said that at the time. I said the thing about being afraid versus being careful. It's the same point. It's not the same point. It's a more polite version of the same point. I was trying to be diplomatic. Ethan. She looked at him with something openly warm in her face, the expression she'd been rationing for months and had apparently stopped rationing sometime in the last hour. You are the least diplomatic person I have regularly encountered in the last 6 years of running a company. That's very specific. I keep specific records. I know you do, he said. It's one of the things. One of the things, she repeated. There's a list, he said. She looked at him for a moment, this woman who had flown to 31 countries and remembered the conference room and the airport and barely the streets, who was reconstructing a soup from memory and had never managed to finish it correctly, who ran 4 miles a day partly to have 1 hour nobody could reach her, who had learned to carry everything alone and was slowly, imperfectly, trying to learn what setting things down felt like. Tell me the list, she said. So he told her. Not all of it. It was not the kind of list you got through in one sitting, and they were not people who would have wanted to. He told her enough. The way she listened, the way she asked questions with actual curiosity instead of social performance, the soup she kept trying to get right, the thumb pressed against the index finger when she was thinking, the way she'd held the door for a stranger in the service corridor before she knew anyone was watching, the way she'd written 2 words on a planning sheet instead of saying them out loud, because writing them felt smaller and she'd needed them to be small enough to be possible. She was quiet through most of it, in the specific way she went quiet when she was receiving something rather than processing it. The difference between a calculation and just letting something be true. Outside, through the glass, the city continued its late-night business. Ethan heard Marcus's voice one final time, faint through the door. A direction to his crew, the closing note of the decommission. Then the sound of the service corridor door, the distant mechanical sound of equipment being loaded, and then the building settling into its own silence. I have a question, Victoria said. Okay. The farmer's market, Sunday. Can we go again? He looked at her. Yeah. And will you show me how to cook the squash correctly this time? Because I've now bought 3 of them and they're sitting in my kitchen and I don't know what to do with them. How many squash do you have? 3, she said. I keep buying them. Why do you keep buying them? She looked at him with the expression of someone who knows the answer and is deciding whether to say it plainly. Then she said, Because the first time I bought them, I was at the market with you and it felt like something I was allowed to want. He looked at her for a long moment. Sunday, he said, we'll deal with the squash. She nodded, and then, because it had been a long evening and a longer 6 months, and the window ledge of a 4th-floor lounge in the Harbor District was not the most comfortable place to sit, she moved from the ledge to the chair beside his, which put them close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and she left it there, and he left it there, and they stayed like that for a while in the quiet room with the city going on outside. Boo. He drove home at midnight. Lily was at Carla's Friday night, a planned sleepover that Carla had arranged with the specific thoughtfulness of someone who had heard enough about Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings to understand that her brother occasionally needed hours that weren't structured around a 6-year-old's timeline. The apartment was quiet, in the way it only went quiet when Lily was genuinely gone. A different quality of quiet than when she was asleep in the next room, something less inhabited, the particular silence that reminded him that the life he'd built was both enough and different from what he might have imagined, once, before all the adjustments that had made it what it was. He sat at the kitchen table for a while, didn't turn on the television, didn't pick up his phone. He thought about the planning sheet, worn at the edges and folded along lines that had been refolded, sitting on a window ledge in a 4th-floor lounge. He thought about the fact that she'd kept it, not deliberately, she'd said, found it in a file folder. And he thought about the things you kept without deciding to, the things that turned out to be more significant than you'd known when you set them down. He thought about what he would tell Lily. Not tonight, not as a formal announcement. Lily was 6, and formal announcements were a register she had limited patience for. He'd tell her the way he told her everything, specifically, practically, making space for her questions, answering them honestly. He'd say that Victoria was going to be around more, which Lily would receive through the filter of her most pressing concern, which would probably be whether Maple the horse had any relatives Victoria might have information about. He thought about the soup Victoria was still trying to reconstruct. He thought about how sometimes you carried something for a long time without being sure you were getting it right, and you kept trying because the getting rightness wasn't actually the point. The trying was the point, the choosing to try again, the fact that some things were worth the repeated attempt. He thought about a 6-year-old who had handed her hand to a stranger at a kitchen doorway without calculating whether it was safe because she'd assessed the room and found it good, and she was her father's daughter. He thought about what it meant to run the math every night. Am I doing enough? Is enough the right measure? And how the math changed when you stopped running it alone. Not because someone else carried it. That wasn't what happened when another person came into your life, whatever stories suggested. The math stayed yours. You kept the responsibility, kept the weight of what mattered, but the running of it changed because there was someone in the next room or at the end of the phone or across a kitchen table learning to cut squash. Who knew what the numbers meant to you? Who was paying attention to the things you were paying attention to? That was the thing, he thought. Not rescue, not completion, just witnessed. The particular and underrated grace of being witnessed by someone who chose to look. He picked up his phone, typed a message. Safe drive home? Her reply came in 4 minutes, which he estimated was the time it took to reach her building. Yes, the squash situation in my kitchen is worse than I described. There are actually 4. He typed back. Why do you keep telling me 3? Her reply. Because 4 sounds like a problem and 3 sounds like a quirk. He typed, 4 is a quirk. 5 would be a problem. A pause. Then, I'll keep that in mind for next week. He set the phone down and sat in his quiet kitchen and laughed. There's a thing that people say about love, that it arrives, that it happens to you, that it finds you when you've stopped looking. And maybe that's true for some people, in some forms. But what Ethan Cross understood, sitting at his kitchen table at midnight in the apartment where he'd built a life out of adjustments and necessary improvisations, was that the thing he'd found with Victoria Sterling had not arrived. It had accumulated. It was 6 days on a terrace and a sandwich with no mustard. It was a parking garage and a concrete barrier and 3 minutes of a woman being a person instead of a role. It was a planning sheet with 2 words in the corner. It was a contract she should never have sent, and a phone call where he said the true thing simply. It was a dinner that went 3 hours and a walk in weather too cold for walking and a book from a Chicago bookshop. It was a child who grabbed a hand without asking and a woman who had not let go. It was every time either of them had chosen to stay in the room when leaving would have been easier. That was what he wanted to hold on to. Not the romance of it, though it was romantic in its imperfect and sideways way. The practice of it. The fact that the most important things in a life were not the moments of arrival, they were the small, repeated choices, made without ceremony, made without guarantee, made because you had looked at the thing in front of you and decided it was worth choosing again. He was 32 years old, and he had a daughter who drew horses and a job he was good at, and a woman who bought squash she couldn't cook and was slowly learning to put the bag down. He had a neighbor who accepted banana bread as currency, and a sister who asked pointed questions about vegetables, and a crew lead who noticed everything and said nothing directly, and was, for these reasons, his closest friend. It was not a perfect life. It had never been a perfect life. It was his, specifically, with his fingerprints all over it, and it was real, and it was full, and tonight it was a little fuller than it had been when he woke up. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And somewhere across the Harbor District, in an apartment with 4 squash on the kitchen counter, Victoria Sterling set the worn planning sheet on her nightstand and looked at the 2 words in the corner one more time, and turned off her own light. After Saturday had come. It turned out to be better than either of them had planned.